Talk. Party evolution, new colonial policy. 1846 to 1850. I shall ever thankfully rejoice to have lived in a period when so blessed a change in our colonial policy was brought about, a change which is full of promise and profit to a country having such claims on mankind as England, but also a change of system, in which we have done no more than make a transition from misfortune and from evil, back to the rules of justice, of reason, of nature, and of common sense. Gladstone, 1856. The fall of Peel and the breakup of the Conservative Party in 1846 led to a long train of public inconveniences. When Lord John Russell was forming his government, he saw Peel, and proposed to include any of his party. Peel thought such a junction under existing circumstances unadvisable, but said he should have no ground of complaint if Lord John made offers to any of his friends, and he should not attempt to influence them either way. 207. The action ended in a proposal of office to Dalhousie, Lincoln, and Sidney Herbert. Nothing came of it, and the Whigs were left to go on as they best could upon the narrow base of their own party. The Protectionists gave them to understand that before Bentinck and his friends made up their minds to turn Peel out, they had decided that it would not be fair to put the Whigs in merely to punish the betrayer, and then to turn round upon them. On the contrary, fair and candid support was what they intended. The Conservative government had carried liberal measures, the Liberal government subsisted on Conservative declarations. Such was this singular situation. Peelites and Protectionists. The Peelites, according to a memorandum of Mr. Gladstone's, from a number approaching 120 in the Corn Law crisis of 1846, were reduced at once by the election of 1847 to less than half. This number, added to the Liberal force, gave free trade a very large majority, added to the Protectionists it just turned the balance in their favor. So long as Sir Robert Peel lived, down to June 1850, the entire body never voted with the Protectionists. From the first a distinction arose among Peel's adherents that widened, as time went on, and led to a long series of doubts, perturbations, maneuvers. These perplexities lasted down to 1859, and they constitute a vital chapter in Mr. Gladstone's political story. The distinction was in the nature of political things. Many of those who had stood by Peel's side in the day of battle, and who still stood by him in the curious morrow that combined victorious policy with personal defeat, were in more or less latent sympathy with the severed Protectionists in everything except protection. 208. Differing from these, says Mr. Gladstone, others of the Peelites whose opinions were more akin to those of the Liberals, cherished, nevertheless, personal sympathies and lingering wishes which made them tardy, perhaps unduly tardy, in drawing towards that party. I think that this description applied in some degree to Mr. Sidney Herbert, and in the same or a greater degree to myself. 209. Shortly described, the Peelites were all free trade conservatives, drawn by undercurrents, according to temperament, circumstances, and all the other things that turn the balance of men's opinions, to antipodean poles of the political compass. We have no party, Mr. Gladstone tells his father in June 1849, no organization, no whipper-in, and under these circumstances we cannot exercise any considerable degree of permanent influence as a body. The leading sentiment that guided the proceedings of the whole body of Peelites alike was a desire to give to protection its final quietus. While the younger members of the Peel cabinet held that this could only be done in one way, namely, by forcing the Protectionists into office where they must put their professions to the proof, Peel himself, and Graham with him, took a directly opposite view, and adopted as the leading principle of their action the vital necessity of keeping the Protectionists out. This broad difference led to no diminution of personal intercourse or political attachment. Certainly this was not due, says Mr. Gladstone, to any desire, at least in Sir or Peel's mind, for, or contemplation of, coalition with the Liberal party. It sprang entirely from a belief on his part that the chiefs of the Protectionists would on their accession to power endeavor to establish a policy in accordance with the designation of their party, and would in so doing probably convulse the country. As long as Lord George Bentinck lived, with his iron will and strong convictions, this was a contingency that could not be overlooked. But he died in 1848, and with his death it became a visionary dream. Yet I remember well Sir Robert Peel saying to me, when I was endeavoring to stir him up on some great fault, as I thought it, in the colonial policy of the ministers, I foresee a tremendous struggle in this country for the restoration of protection. He would sometimes even threaten us with the possibility of being sent for if a crisis should occur, which was a thing far enough from our limited conceptions. We were flatly at issue with him on this opinion. We even considered that as long as the protectionists had no responsibilities but those of opposition, and as there were 250 seats in Parliament to be won by chanting the woes of the land and promising redress, there would be protectionists in plenty to fill the left-hand benches on those terms. Relations with Peel. The question what it was that finally converted the country to free trade is not easy to answer. Not the arguments of Cobden, for in the summer of 1845 even his buoyant spirit perceived that some precipitating event, and not reasoning, would decide. His appeals had become, as Disraeli wrote, both to nation and Parliament a wearisome iteration, and he knew it. Those arguments, it is true, had laid the foundations of the case in all their solidity and breadth. But until the emergency in Ireland presented itself, and until prosperity had justified the experiment, Peel was hardly wrong in reckoning on the possibility of a protectionist reaction. Even the new prosperity and contentment of the country were capable of being explained by the extraordinary employment found in the creation of railways. As Mr. Gladstone said to a correspondent in the autumn of 1846, the liberal proceedings of conservative governments, and the conservative proceedings of the new liberal administration, unite in pointing to the propriety of an abstinence from high-pitched opinions. This was a euphemism. What it really meant was that outside of protection no high-pitched opinions on any other subject were available. The tenets of party throughout this embarrassed period from 1846 to 1852 were shifting, equivocal, and fluid. Nor even in the period that followed did they very rapidly consolidate. Mr. Gladstone writes to his father, June 30, 1849. I will only add a few words about your desire that I should withdraw my confidence from Peel. My feelings of admiration, attachment, and gratitude to him I do not expect to lose, and I agree with Graham that he has done more and suffered more than any other living statesman for the good of the people. But still I must confess with sorrow that the present course of events tends to separate and disorganize the small troop of the late government and their adherents. On the West Indian question last year I, with others, spoke and voted against Peel. On the navigation law this year I was saved from it only by the ship owners and their friends, who would not adopt a plan upon the basis I proposed. Upon Canada, a vital question, I again spoke and voted against him, 210, and upon other colonial questions, yet most important to the government, I fear even this year the same thing may happen again. However painful, then, it may be to me to differ from him, it is plain that my conduct is not placed in his hands to govern. We find an illustration of the distractions of this long day of party metamorphosis, as well as an example of what was regarded as Mr. Gladstone's over-ingenuity, in one among other passing divergences between him and his chief. Mr. Disraeli brought forward a motion, February 19, 1850, of a very familiar kind, on the distress of the agricultural classes and the insecurity of relief of rural burdens. Bright bluntly denied that there was a case in which the fee of land had been depreciated or rent been permanently lowered. Graham said the movers' policy was simply a transfer of the entire poor rate to the consolidated fund, violating the principles of local control and inviting prodigal expenditure. Fortune then, in Mr. Disraeli's own language, sent him an unexpected champion, by whom, according to him, Graham was fairly unhorsed. The reader will hardly think so, for though the unexpected champion was Mr. Gladstone, he found no better reason for supporting the motion than that its adoption would weaken the case for restoring protection. As if the landlords and farmers were likely to be satisfied with a small admission of a great claim, while all the rest of their claim was to be as bitterly contested as ever, with the transfer of a shabby couple of millions from their own shoulders to the consolidated fund, when they were clamoring that 14 millions would hardly be enough. Peel rose later, promptly took this plain point against his ingenious lieutenant, and then proceeded to one more of his elaborate defenses, both of free trade and of his own motives and character. For the last time, as it was to happen, Peel declared that for Mr. Gladstone he had the greatest respect and admiration. I was associated with him in the preparation and conduct of those measures, to the desire of maintaining which he partly attributes the conclusion at which he has arrived. I derived from him the most zealous, the most effective assistance, and it is no small consolation to me to hear from him, although in this particular motion we arrive at different conclusions, that his confidence in the justice of those principles for which we in common contended remains entirely unshaken. 211. On his position. On this particular battle, as well as on more general matter, a letter from Mr. Gladstone to his wife, February 22, 1850, sheds some light. To Mrs. Gladstone. Indeed, you do rise to very daring flights today, and suggest many things that flow from your own deep affection, which, perhaps, disguises from you some things that are nevertheless real. I cannot form to myself any other conception of my duty in Parliament except the simple one of acting independently, without faction, and without subserviency, on all questions as they arise. To the formation of a party, or even of the nucleus of a party, there are in my circumstances many obstacles. I have been talking over these matters with Manning this morning, and I found him to be of the opinion which is deliberately mine, namely, that it is better that I should not be the head or leader even of my own contemporaries, that there are others of them whose position is less embarrassed, and more favorable and powerful, particularly from birth or wealth or both. 3 or 4 years ago, before I had much considered the matter, and while we still felt as if Peel were our actual chief in politics, I did not think so, but perhaps thought or assumed that as, up to the then present time, I had discharged some prominent duties in office and in Parliament, the first place might naturally fall to me when the other men were no longer in the van. But since we have become more disorganized, and I have had little sense of union except with the men of my own standing, and I have felt more of the actual state of things, and how this or that would work in the House of Commons, I have come to be satisfied in my own mind that, if there were a question whether there should be a leader and who it should be, it would be much better that either Lincoln or Herbert should assume that post, whatever share of the mere work might fall on me. I have viewed the matter very drilly, and so perhaps you will think I have written on it. To turn then to what is more amusing, the battle of last night. After much consideration and conference with Herbert, who has had an attack of bilious fever and could not come down, though much better, and soon, I hope, to be out again, but who agreed with me, I determined that I ought to vote last night with Disraeli, and made up my mind accordingly, which involved saying why, at some period of the night. I was anxious to do it early, as I knew Graham would speak on the other side, and did not wish any conflict even of reasoning with him. But he found I was going to speak, and I suppose may have had some similar wish. At any rate, he had the opportunity of following Stafford, who began the debate, as he was to take the other side. Then there was an amusing scene between him and Peel. Both rose and stood in competition for the speaker's eye. The speaker had seen Graham first, and he got it. But when he was speaking I felt I had no choice but to follow him. He made so very able a speech that this was no pleasant prospect, but I acquired the courage that proceeds from fear, according to a line from Ariosto, Chi per virtu, chi per por avail, one from valor, another from fear, is strong, and made my plunge when he sat down. But the speaker was not dreaming of me, and called a certain Mr. Scott who had risen at the same time. Upon this I sat down again, and there was a great uproar because the House, always anticipating more or less interest when men speak on opposite sides and in succession, who are usually together, called for me. So I was up again, and the speaker deserted Scott and called me, and I had to make the best I could after Graham. That is the end of the story, for there is nothing else worth saying. It was at the dinner hour from 7 to 7 3/4, and then I went home for a little quiet. Peel again replied upon me, but I did not hear that part of him, and Disraeli showed the marvelous talent that he has, for summing up with brilliancy, buoyancy, and comprehensiveness at the close of a debate. You have heard me speak of that talent before when I have been wholly against him, but never, last night or at any other time, would I go to him for conviction, but for the delight of the ear and the fancy. What a long story! Partial withdrawal. During the Parliament that sat from 1847 to 1852, Mr. Gladstone's political life was in partial abeyance. The whole burden of conducting the affairs of the Hawarden estate fell upon him. For 5 years, he said, it constituted my daily and continuing care, while parliamentary action was only occasional. It supplied in fact my education for the office of Finance Minister. The demands of church matters were anxious and at times absorbing. He warmly favored and spoke copiously for the repeal of the navigation laws. He desired, however, to accept a recent overture from America which offered everything, even their vast coasting trade, upon a footing of absolute reciprocity. I gave notice, he says, of a motion to that effect. But the government declined to accept it. I accordingly withdrew it. At this the Tories were much put about. I, who had thought of things only and not taken persons into view, was surprised at their surprise. It did not occur to me that by my public notification I had given to the opposition generally something like a vested interest in my proposal. I certainly should have done better never to have given my notice. This is one of the cases illustrating the extreme slowness of my political education. The sentence about thinking of things only and leaving persons out indicates a turn of mind that partly for great good, partly for some evil, never wholly disappeared. Yet partially withdrawn as he was from active life in the House of Commons, Mr. Gladstone was far too acute an observer to have any leanings to the delusive self-indulgence of temporary retirements. To his intimate friend, Sir Walter James, who seems to have nursed some such intention, he wrote at this very time, February 13, 1847.